Hi everyone, good morning. So today I want to talk about human capital as a determinant of growth. So currently in the world, there's a global search for sustainable factors of development, and the endogenous growth theory, which emphasizes the role of human capital innovation, constitutes a significant paradigm in growth theory models. So numerous scholars build up on Barra's important finding that human capital investments enable sustainable development. So the goals of this presentation will be to briefly evaluate some of the key issues pertaining to human capital as a determinant of growth, and then to assess education as a form of smart power. So the terms human capital and education will be to an extent interchangeable today, which is revealed in a number of definitions of human capital. For instance, the UN defines it as a productive wealth embodied in labor, skills, and knowledge. Human capital also refers to the acquisition of skills and know-how through education. So the majority of studies which evaluate this, they use education-related proxies such as enrollment rates or tests to determine the quality of human capital. As argued by Coleman, one of the most important developments in the economics of education in the past 30 years has been the concept that physical capital, as embodied in tools and equipment, can be extended to human capital. Human capital is often defined as part of intellectual capital and or intangible resources of firms and countries. So, multiple scholars have conducted empirical studies and found positive correlations between education and economic growth. Among them, Becker, Barrow, Monk and Romero and Whale, Barrow and Lee, Kruger and Lindahl, and many others. Sabate and Johansson state that education and training remain implicit cornerstones of national economic competitiveness. The authors also highlight indirect benefits of investing into education, and the indirect benefits include income growth, health outcomes, political stability, higher fertility rates, trade openness, and proliferation of political rights. It's also important to note, however, that the relationship between education and development is not simple or linear. So some authors, such as Barrow and Aguilar, suggest simultaneous investments in human capital, infrastructure, and health for better results. It's also important to highlight that a number of studies actually find the relationship between changes in education and growth surprisingly weak. For instance, Basu and Baturai report that a higher public spending on education decreases per capita growth in the long run, so the effect of public education spending on growth is an empirically unsettled issue. Ben Habib and Spiegel and Pritchett come to this conclusion for their large sample of countries. The study by Monte also did not verify the causality between education and economic growth. Kurs et al. State that changes in higher education have a null effect on U.S. economic growth. However, the authors state that such results could have come from an omission of an important variable, privatization of higher education. So in contrast, Yamarik finds quantifiable positive relationship between education and U.S. state-level growth. So this makes us think why there are discrepancies in studies on human capital and growth, and one can argue that they often result from different estimation patterns and employed variables. So Kruger and Lindahl argue that changes in education positively correlate with economic growth once the measurement errors are considered for. De La Fuente and Dominic revised Barrow and Lee's study with a data set sample of 21 OECD countries, and as a result of considering previously unexploited parameters, they successfully removed the error margins. So Permani also finds the empirical evidence of relationship between education and growth to be ambiguous due to econometric and model specification differences between the studies. So another issue is obviously the choice of country cases. Most studies focus on developed country cases. Meanwhile, there are different factors affecting economic dynamism between developed and developing countries. Kadri and Wahid studied the sample of 106 countries and find that the relationship between human capital and economic growth is positive, and that the investments are more necessary for middle and low-income countries. The authors build up on Barr's finding that human capital is a key element that enables a poor country to catch up with established ones. Similarly, according to Perlo, Freeman, and Weber, poor countries cannot opt for growth without attention to education. So there's currently a need to study the cases of emerging countries with relation to this issue. So another factor that contributes to discrepancies is the different levels of education employed in studies. So authors like Weber, they find a positive effect of education on economic growth after estimating the impact of different levels, so primary, secondary, and tertiary, as well as Keller, who estimated the individual effects of primary, secondary, higher education for clear results. It's also important to differentiate between private and public sectors of education. Studies demonstrate that there's a positive relationship between public education expenditure and growth. The state, however, is no longer the only provider of educational services. In fact, there's an increasing competition between public and private educational institutions worldwide. So the critique of the studies on human capital can be partially explained through the different measurement parameters. Finally, as argued by Johansson, the most important difficulty in measuring human capital comes from the fact that it involves measuring human behavior, which to a great extent is not measurable and ambiguous. So the endogenous growth theory is a substantial model in neoclassical economics. However, it's also important to briefly outline other growth theories. There are exogenous models which are influential, such as Harari-Domar model, and they explain economies' growth in terms of levels of savings and productivity of capital, meaning that the more investment leads to greater productivity and greater economic growth. However, this model is often criticized for adopting many assumptions and facts, such as rate of savings, price of labor and capital, etc. The traditional determinants of growth include general economic policies, such as trade and macroeconomic conditions. According to Fisher, however, macroeconomic conditions are necessary for economic growth, but are not sufficient. FDI is also often stressed as the main driver of technology transfer, internationalization of business activities in economic growth, as well as non-economic factors play a significant role. For instance, economic sociology focuses on socio-cultural factors such as ethnicity, demography, language, religion, and cultural diversity for economic growth. Sachs and Warner and Gallup et al. Highlight the significance of geographical factors, so the resources of the country, and also authors highlight political factors because the government policies can either induce or inhibit states' development. The state of institutions is also often regarded as a crucial factor for economic development. Easterly argues that the growth factors would not be successful without the stable institutional environment, and moreover, Roderick defined property rights in institutions as direct determinants of growth. Mamoun and Murshid appropriately note that economic development is a complex phenomenon that encompasses a multitude of social, economic, political, and scientific determinants. Therefore, the economic prosperity is multifaceted and the factors of development are interdependent. So perhaps the existing literature should not strictly separate the growth models and instead view them together. In this regard, Easterly argues that growth factors such as education alone would not be successful without a stable institutional environment. Institutions and human capital investments are equally important, and when pursued together, lead to economic prosperity. And this was argued in an empirical study by Mamoun and Murshid also. So far, we have highlighted the complexity of the relationship between human capital, investments, and development, stressing the need for a holistic approach in evaluating the determinants of growth. So now we'll move away from looking at education from a strictly economics point of view and instead adopt a lens of an international relations discipline. So currently, global society is undergoing numerous transformations and faces serious economic, political, and cultural challenges, as we all know. As a result of power diffusion from developed to developing countries and from states to non-state actors, as well as technological advances and empowered global networks, international politics are undergoing a fundamental shift. So the new global paradigm shifts the existing world order and makes the reshaping of policies very critical. Traditionally, the states opted for hard power tools. In fact, the real politic thinking is still largely dominates the field of international relations. Meanwhile, scholars and practitioners worldwide recognize the rising value of soft power approaches, since the economic and political challenges can no longer be easily solved by military power or policy innovation alone. So, in the context of this presentation, I cannot go deep into evaluating the different components, resources, and problematic aspects of soft power, which is the concentration of my thesis. However, one can note that soft power cannot be a remedy recipe for everything. Some foreign policy objectives are better suited to soft power. Not want to propagate a state's agenda, but that's why what he experiences abroad is considered authentic and valuable. And in fact, if one considers cultural exchanges as free from political agendas, there can emerge a political and social advantage from it. So these were all the soft power qualities of education. So now the hard benefits. Educational programs and exchanges ultimately lead to the proliferation of human capital and also affect a number of other developmental goals, as highlighted earlier in this presentation. In particular, investments into education benefit the economy through the development of creative industries. And the emerging creative economy has become a leading component of economic growth and social cohesion, although many emerging states have not been able to harness their creative capacity. The creative economy approach, if adopted and implemented correctly, allows leveraging the potential of nations to provide new economic opportunities and build lasting global relationships. So through investments in education and exchange programs, developed countries are able to create goodwill, build partnerships, and attract high-skilled migrants, even if temporary. Meanwhile, developing countries, they benefit from better specialists who potentially facilitate their own educational developmental reforms. In fact, according to UNDP report, the rise of the Global South has largely resulted from applying pragmatic policies, which included improvement of human capital development. But as the development competition today is less for markets but more for capital, talent, and ideas, brain drain can become a serious concern for developing countries. However, despite the possible counter effects, according to Dorkier and Rappaport, high-skill immigration does not necessarily deplete home country's human capital, but generates positive network externalities. So the ability of developing countries to continue and sustain their rise will depend on their ability to combine economic growth and human development. So, smart power. Not all the soft power investments create equal outcomes, and there's a hierarchy of outcomes depending on the issues of time, so sustainability, and scale, that is of change. So there's evidence that education represents a sustainable investment with the possibility of spillover effects. For instance, there's a PhD thesis by Midalis, which demonstrated that Fulbright program has largely contributed to the development of the Hungarian higher education system. Educational programs and exchanges shape foreign opinion, create goodwill, but more importantly, they contribute to the economic competitiveness and development of creative industries, which are the attributes of hard power. Smart power aims at achieving important goals, which Joseph Nye defined as global public goods. Some global goods generate negative spillovers, so perhaps education can be viewed as a global good, investments in which can generate positive spillover effects for the global society. So, we have briefly evaluated human capital's determinant of growth, providing possible explanations for the discrepancies in studies. There's also a need for a holistic approach when discussing drivers of growth, for instance, by combining institutionalism and human capital frameworks. It was also argued that education represents an effective and sustainable smart power investment with both soft and hard spillover benefits. Perhaps the key question today is no longer whether or not investments in education matter, but how and when. Thank you.
Heike, thank you so much. That was a very academic but very interesting
I'm glad.
presentation. Yeah, I feel like I've learned a lot. That was it was really great. I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Does anyone have anything to add? One in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question about the gender issue.
Which issue?
Gender.
Oh, gender issue.
Yeah, one about human capital, because there's this African proverb that I always remember: educate a man and you have educated an individual. That's a good thing. Educate a woman and you'll have educated a nation. Especially for developing countries, the gender education is one of the primary things, because there's a lot of catching up to do. Do you think that should be added onto the growth theories, or they should take that in particular consideration, apart from what is being done with the Human Development Index?
This is an excellent point. There are, in fact, numerous studies which highlight, would differentiate between investing in education for women as opposed to education for men, because in many societies there's, big gap between educated women and men, and that's why this is definitely an important concern. The reason why I have not included this in this particular presentation is because my case study will be Kazakhstan. So human capital and education in Kazakhstan, they have different issues there. So gender is not one of the issues. Because of the Soviet legacy, it is a rule that 99% of the population is literate, and actually women were often the drivers of growth, working everywhere, from state-level jobs to industries, etc. So for my empirical case, this is not a concern, but in general, definitely, the gender studies with regards to human capital are very important and in many areas of the world.
Hi, Hilda Schweiger here. I enjoyed your presentation, but I've got two questions for you. The first one is, you mentioned developed countries. Now, just last week, one of our professors told us there is no developed country, because countries are actually, they're evolving every day. We're learning new things. So what is a developed country? Because if you are developed, then you've reached the maximum and you cannot evolve anymore. That's just a comment. My second question is more like, you've spoken about hard power and soft power. Do you think in the future we're going to have warm power or lukewarm power? Since if you have to use both hard and soft to diffuse a situation, what will we call it? And then, and what do you think, what kind of power should be applied in the Ukraine situation? Soft power or hard power?
Okay, I'll try to remember all that. Keep the microphone in case I ask you again. So with regards to definitions of developed versus developing, yes, this is in fact very ambiguous and controversial often in many studies. What I meant is, I was referring to industrial development, because a lot of reports, UN and many others, which are regarded as highly influential in this regard, they call it by different names. Some say developed developing, some state established emerging, some call it global north and global south. So there are different ways of calling the countries. What I wanted to differentiate is the issue of a brain drain, that often, more established markets, they're able to successfully attract human capital and, people with, good quality education and skills, while the developing countries lose either their own human capital or they are not able to attract unless, for big money. And I was talking about the fact that, in fact, no. Even if people leave from their own countries and they go abroad, there are studies which empirically show that that actually indirectly has, multiplier effects, and it still generates externalities, positive externalities for both host countries and home countries where the specialists left from. And there are examples of Africa and medical drain, and there's different examples of that where one can see that. With regards to warm power, it's a very nice name. Smart power is very new in the field of international relations, and one can argue that it takes many different forms. For instance, EU's power is often referred as normative power because EU has access to military and it can use economic sanctions, but at the same time, EU is able to create norms in its own image and to affect global policies because they're so influential and their credibility is high. So this is called in academia EU's normative power, which is also a form of smart power. So definitely warm would be something, a mixture of both. So it will be like something similar. And what was your third question?
No, that was it. But did you study China? Because I read that China has got the largest brain drain, that most of the young people that go out to study abroad never actually come back home. Have you done any studies on that?
No, I have not. Currently, I am in the phase of literature review for my PhD thesis, and it's more on education as a form of smart power back home in Kazakhstan.